Hello and welcome to our discussion, Returning Stronger, the Future of Women's Football. I'm Dr. Carrie Dunn. I'm an author and researcher, and my most recent book, The Pride of the Lionesses, looks at the changing face of women's football in England in the run-up to the 2019 Women's World Cup. And I have the privilege today of chairing what I know is going to be an interesting and massively valuable discussion. I'll introduce our fabulous panellists shortly, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we'll be discussing first. As the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting policies of lockdown and economic shock impact football across the globe, women's football is particularly vulnerable. As well as halting the momentum built through the World Cup last year, the anticipation of the Euros and the encouraging growth at grassroots level, the disruption caused by the pandemic has arguably revealed the fragility of structures holding up women's sport. Chronic underfunding leaves women's clubs vulnerable in harsh economic climates, and there are examples where survival of men's football is being explicitly prioritised. In countries all over the world, women's leagues have been cancelled, while men's leagues will still get concluded. And a recent FIFPro report raised awareness of an almost existential threat to the women's game if no specific considerations are given to protect the women's football industry. However, this is also a massively exciting time for women's football, with huge progress being made. FIFA figures indicate that last year's Women's World Cup reached 1.2 billion people. In 2019, 73% of FIFA's member associations had an active senior women's national team, compared to 55% in 2015. And we're seeing growing organisation of women's teams and players. For example, the increasing professionalisation we're seeing around the world, the big steps being made in improved contracts, as we've seen recently in Spain. Outside companies are also seeing the value of women's football. Barclays came to a very lucrative deal with the Women's Super League, and big name sponsors backed the US 18 in their equal pay lawsuit with their federation, and men's clubs are seeking to affiliate with women's teams. So the session today will seek to shine a light on the unique circumstances facing women's football, and to discuss possible solutions to ensure the future of women's football is not only protected, but also reshaped, reformed, and invigorated. So I'd like to welcome our panellists with no further ado. Anita Asante, currently of Chelsea, formerly of England with 70 caps to her name. Amanda Vandervort, Chief Women's Football Officer at FIFPro, the Global Players Football Union. Brenda Elsey, Fair Lead for the Americas, expert in women's sport in Latin America, and one of the hosts of feminist sport podcast Burn It All Down. Tatjana Haenni, Head of Women's Football at the Swiss FA and a global expert on women's football, working to develop the sport throughout her career, including in her previous role as Director of Women's Football at FIFA. So we're going to move on to questions for the panellists now. We heard yesterday that discussions are continuing regarding how the Women's Super League season might conclude. It's all very vague at the moment. It's not quite clear what's going to happen. Do you feel like your interests as players are being listened to and represented?
Well, I can only talk from the perspective of my club and my teammates, and I think we've had a lot of dialogue around this throughout the weeks as this pandemic has ensued, and we've had a lot of transparency actually with our club, and they've been pretty honest about what they know and they don't know. So in terms of that, I think it's been good for us because we've been able to relay the concerns that we might have to our club captain, who's also then therefore taking it forward to the FA and taking those discussions with the other captains throughout the league to put that forward. So, I mean, in terms of getting our voices and our opinions across, I think that's definitely come across from our end. But in terms of our interest in, you know, we have aligned ourselves with the Premier League in terms of whatever they do, perhaps we'll do. But of course, the challenges we face are different.
Mm. I mean, there were some reports this weekend about WSL players feeling, I think the quote was, mentally checked out and just not feeling that they should be resuming play at all at the moment. How accurate would you say that is amongst your squad?
Yeah, I think we had very mixed opinions and feelings as to the return to play. And I think it's because all our circumstances are slightly different as well, where we're situated, what access we have to resources, to the training, to getting that level of motivation, to feeling like, am I at where I need to be come a return to play is very different for everybody, because they also have different responsibilities at home and other things to manage. So yeah, I can imagine for a lot of players, the uncertainty of it all has been very difficult in terms of managing a training structure of which we're used to. You know, we align our training with progressions, especially when you're coming towards peak performance. And if you're uncertain, then it's really hard to manage, I guess, your body, your mental state, and actually what are you competing for at the end if indeed it doesn't happen.
Have they given you a training plan to be following by yourself in this kind of hiatus?
Yeah, we've had regular updates with the club and our head of performance and all the sports trainers. We've had access to yoga, you know, mental well-being, a range of things. You know, if we had watt bikes available or whatever, we've had training programs related to that. So I think they've really done their best, considering the circumstances, to try and support us in terms of understanding what resources and challenges we have with regards to training. But again, yeah, it's a really tough time, because like I said, they also don't know, you know, when the dates of resuming or not resuming will be. We've planned in a way as though we will return. So that's how we've managed our training load.
Cool. And so there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. So move on to think a little bit about the long-term aspect of things, and I'll direct some questions to you, Amanda. The recent FIFPro report on women's football talked about the importance of long-term sustainable structures being built into women's football, and there's this aim for all member associations of FIFA to have a comprehensive strategy just for women's football within the next 2 years. What would you say from your perspective are the most important points the strategy should cover to guarantee future security for female footballers?
Well, it is quite a question when we're looking at a global ecosystem of women's football and talking about what are the key ingredients for success. You know, I think having a strategy is probably a good starting place for all of the member associations, one that actively includes women's football and women in football and football leadership. But, you know, the breaking it down to some real specifics, I think for me, it's about access and opportunity. So ensuring that anyone who wants to watch or participate in the game has the access to do so, and then the opportunity to whether it's play, whether it's coach, referee, be a member of a board. I think those are critical kind of broad strokes when we look at it. Now, you referenced our Raising the Game report, Carrie, and you did such a good job at the beginning of this podcast talking about, I think, the growth of the game that we've seen over the past several years, but especially last year with the World Cup and the, I guess, economic growth that we've seen, whether it's more people in the stands, more people watching on television, and more opportunities for players themselves to be part of the game. And so now with that, we also saw a growth in infrastructure and a growth in bringing women's football forward. And so, yeah, a lot of that is in question right now as coronavirus has thrown it's thrown a wrench into the plans of women's football. And we had this incredible momentum and this kind of these sails, the wind in our sails. And now we're looking at it and saying, okay, how do we ensure globally and both globally and at a domestic level, how do we ensure that not only the systems and structures persist so that women do have access and opportunity as we go into the future, but also that they have the opportunity to be the highest level competitors, the highest level athletes possible. I think that's going to continue to improve the economics and continue to improve the game itself.
One thing I know from researching my book is that quite often, certainly in the early days of the WSL and possibly still now, quite often the contracts that are offered to professional female footballers have been taken from the men's game and just given to women without consideration of the special things that female footballers might need, for example, maternity leave. Do you think there's any other differences in the type of contract or employment considerations that clubs should be offering their female pros compared to the male equivalents?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't think the approach of comparing men to women is necessarily um, the right one for me to speak to on a global level. But what I do think is when we look at women's football contracts, generally what we see, this is our research from 2017 global employment report that we did related to women's football, we see that a small number, at less than 20%, actually have contracts in the first place. So I mean, that's a good starting point. Let's make sure that women have contracts that are papered. And also they're very short in duration. So averaging a year in duration, and that's increased over the past couple of years. We've seen in our research as well. But I think those kinds of issues, when we start to look at contracting women footballers, I think those are some of the kind of broad issues for us to tackle. You know, I mean, there's going to be differences between some of the more high functioning countries and opportunities that exist there versus maybe some of the more developing countries and areas where professionalization is just getting started. But certainly women professional footballers, you know, with their contracts, ultimately contracts define the employment relationship that you have and the opportunities that you have within that to be successful.
You mentioned the short duration of contracts. I mean, why has that historically been so short? You know, you see men being offered kind of 4-year, 5-year deals. Is it simply because of the lack of financial security in the women's game?
Maybe. I think that's a good question for someone like Tatjana or organizational people who are writing the contracts and making them short durations of time. I mean, you know, we know that you know, a 6-month or a 1-year contract creates instability for players themselves. It creates difficult financial situations where they don't know, you know, or even living situations. Like they might not know where they're going to live or where they're going to be playing 6 months from now or a year from now. And certainly that leads to some of the challenges. Yeah.
Okay, well, I was going to move to Tatjana next then. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that, Tatjana. Why have these contracts been so short, do you think, in your experience?
Actually, thanks for passing such a difficult ball to me for my first question. I think it's only my personal opinion, but yes, of course, women's clubs have not the same financial means. So I do think that's one of the factors, but not only, it's also a fact that having contracts is still rather new. Not many players have contracts, or definitely not in many countries. And clubs have to get used to it and learn how to deal with it. And I also think, which we should, a big factor of it is maybe also the whole ecosystem. On the men's side, you do long-term contracts because you want to probably sell a player and you know, make some transfer income there, which in the women's game is definitely not also increasing. I think transfer fees are becoming more common, but are still not the norm, I would say. And then with female players, it's just so much more insecurity. How do we perform as a club? What's the income? In which position are we? Are we Champions League or not? How long is the league running? You know, is this player still playing, or is she pursuing her other career, which might be in another profession because she has finished her studies and is tired of playing football? I mean, I think the top leagues excluded from this comment, where you have fully professional players and you know, they really want to play football. Let's say that's maybe 5 to 8 leagues in the world. The rest is very, very unstable, and that's probably why contracts are only lasting a year, if they have a contract at all.
Thank you. I'm sorry for such a difficult question. First off, I promise the others are much more straightforward.
Oh, well, let's see.
Well, tell us a little bit about how the leagues in Switzerland reacted to the pandemic. What was the initial reaction in terms of the way that matches were dealt with, postponed, etc.?
Yeah, actually, I'm quite happy about this question because I think it's not as negative as the topic was initiated at the beginning. I really think we were a good example why we stopped the league, and that it's not a discriminatory case towards the men. The men have not yet decided how they go on. It's still open, but they might go back and finish the league. And on the women's side, we decided already 4 weeks ago that we will cancel the league and abandon it. We took that decision together, so it was a good communication together with the clubs. And why I'm not feeling bad about it at all is because we just really thought about it. Okay, what is the benefit of waiting or continuing the league? In Switzerland, from the government, we know that we can start the league as of 8th of June. Well, actually, that's the weekend we would have finished the league in a normal case. So if you only start then, we had 12 rounds left. And if you count that, you can't play midweek because our players are not fully professional. They go to school, they work. So you can only play weekends. You need 12 more rounds. I don't know how we would have done it, but we would have had to play until July and August, which means the new season is not going to start in the way you want it to start. I really think the whole health issue is completely not looked at in detail. I don't think these players will be in a super fit shape when they have to start playing football with 2 weeks maybe training time as a team. So there were lots of things we looked at, and our decision together with the clubs was really, let's stop it. We don't lose that much. We don't have the big media contracts. We don't have the big TV contracts. We have no big sponsors. We want clear decisions. We don't want to wait 4, 5, 6 weeks until we know how things will develop. We don't want to start a new season sacrificing holidays for players or a proper preparation time for clubs. So for us, it was really basically a common sense decision. And in this case, I'm quite happy we didn't have to follow the men, because you may think whatever you want, but I do also hear some criticism about the fact that the men want to finish their leagues for for every price, basically.
Mm. And you said that you worked with the clubs, obviously, to make that decision. Was it a unanimous decision, or were some clubs kind of thinking that they might want to continue? What was the reaction like?
Our top team has top league has 8 clubs, and that was quite anonymous. The discussion was more around, should we announce a championship winner, or should we take the league as a whole, as like in a way, basically, as it has not taken place. And obviously there were some clubs more in favor of announcing a championship winning team. I'm not saying which one, but also that was pretty quickly decided. And we took in this respect an approach which was valid for every league in Switzerland. You know, the boys under 18, under 16, other leagues in Switzerland, we all decided not to count this season.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Moving on to you, Brenda. There are a growing number of incidents in Latin America where women's teams are really struggling in terms of sustainability of actually carrying on, being cut, not being paid, all kinds of quite shocking stories. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the situation? I know that's kind of probably easier said than done, but as brief as you can to summarize what's going on.
As brief as I can. As FIFPro says, women's football is an almost existential threat. In Latin America, it's absolutely already existentially threatened. And that means things like completely disbanding the women's team, like Club Universitario in Peru, who won the women's championship last year. The men's team will go on. The women is now suspended indefinitely. In Brazil, they were receiving some kind of supposed help to continue to pay these stipends. I wouldn't say they were contracts. So Santos Dumont and Audax are 2 clubs that the federation was saying they were sending funds to help continue to pay what they had promised the women. Then they received the funds and did not pay the women anything, and reported that, they didn't make us sign anything to pay them. So, we're not doing anything illegal. There aren't really any fully professional contracts in any Latin American league right now that contract the entire team. So you might have, at best, let's say the Colombian league, you might have 5 of the players that have real contracts. They're confused. They haven't been communicated with. and it's been very, very difficult. Women's precarious position has not been considered. So the fact that cutting 50% of a women's player salary is not in any way equivalent to cutting 50% of a Colombian male player salary. So like Independiente de Santa Fe, which did that said 50% across the board. Well, that means very different things, like the difference between making your rent and eating if you're a women's player. That is not the same in the case of men. So we haven't seen any consideration of the ongoing precarity that has faced women footballers across the board. So that's kind of as brief as I can make it. There's a lot more to talk about, but you know,
Okay.
one other thing is just to say, Argentina, like, this is so upsetting because the last 4 years have been so exciting. So it's just like, we've seen the very first professional contracts last year in Argentina, a country with such a storied football history. How can that be possible? And, you know, they still haven't really committed to continuing those. So I'm just want to make the point that part of the frustration and the sort of the painful element of this is that there was such excitement, and that it's not really gaining these clubs much money by cutting these women.
Yeah, my follow-up question was going to be, obviously there's certain elements of precarity anyway for many of these women's teams, but presumably just exacerbated by the pandemic and the situation that all the football finds itself in.
Yeah, what we're hearing from the women is, you know, for example, we hosted an event last week with Latin American women players, and what they're saying is, you know, precarity is an ongoing problem. Sexism is an ongoing problem. But now, under the guise of austerity, clubs that would have had a more difficult time, whether in terms of public relations or their relations with their fan base or club members, now have a kind of moment where they can do maybe some cutting under the guise of austerity that they wanted to anyway. And it's particularly frustrating because you're talking about salaries, like in the case of Colombia, which has professional contracts, which is a minority in Latin America, where they're making the equivalent of about 250 euros a month. And that's already not enough to live in Bogota, and it's not going to save these clubs very much money. So yeah, there's some degree to which you question how much is this actually a necessary step.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to ask some more kind of general questions about where women's football finds itself at the moment, specifically during this pandemic and resuming competition. And I'll kind of put the questions to each of you in turn and maybe broaden it out into a bit of discussion if we can all get off mute in time. So we'll see how we go. So in England and obviously in Germany at the moment, the talk is about resuming competition behind closed doors. So without fans, perhaps squads in quarantine, and then see what happens after that for health and safety reasons. I'll start with you, Neets. How do you feel about playing behind closed doors? Would that be something that you would want to do to get the season finished, or something you feel quite uneasy about?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's just about placing players and everyone who works around the sport in a safe environment. And if it doesn't make sense, considering the virus and what we know, or the lack of information we still are learning about it, then it doesn't make sense, obviously, to play. If indeed they deemed it safe enough for us to return, I imagine lots of players would happily love to resume playing football. You know, since we haven't been training for such a long time. In the fact of women's football, a lot of us are used to playing with minimal crowds, you know, historically. Of course, that has grown and developed, but if anything, we're probably more mentally able to do that and still produce a good product on the pitch. So to that degree, I think it wouldn't affect the women's game significantly from a performance standpoint. But of course, you know, us, like many other sports people, appreciate that fans also make the entertainment value of the game enjoyable, also helps us, motivate us as players on the pitch as well. And they're part of the whole industry and excitement that comes with playing football. So it's not ideal. I'd only probably feel comfortable if I felt that it was a safe and reasonable thing to do, a moral thing to do in the scope of the circumstances.
Thank you. Amanda, how would you feel about seeing behind closed doors matches in women's football?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo Neet's and her comments about the safety of players and everyone around the game as a top priority in these conversations, negotiations, whatever we want to call them, I guess, the ongoing dialogue around the return to play. And I was reading an article in The Guardian actually the other day about the democratization of work and how important it is that humans aren't treated as resources, but actually as human beings. And for me, as I think about this time, I think it's elevated the need in our society for organizations like unions, like FIFPro or in England, the PFA, or unions around the world, in particular, to bring light to these kind of dialogues and these kind of discussions around the needs and concerns that players have, whether it's, coming back to play behind closed doors and the issues that Neet's just talked about, or the issue of coming back after 2 weeks of training, which we talked about, you mentioned earlier as well. That's not very much time for a player to get back and get fit to perform at her peak level. So I think there's a number of considerations and conversations that need to happen to ensure that the return to play is safe for everyone, and behind closed doors or no league or no continuation of a league, or whatever the circumstances are. I think the number one priority has to be the health and safety of everyone involved.
Thank you. Brenda.
Well, I echo both of these comments, but I would hope that they would prioritize the scheduling of women. And I think that's very important. I think footballers as workers should all have proper working conditions and health and safety precautions being taken. And if that's the case, why prioritize the return of men's leagues? I don't, in Latin America, I understand that there's national lockdowns. That seems very sensible and wonderful plans, like in the case of Ecuador and Argentina. I guess my concern is that when there is an attempt to go back, when it is clear and safe, whether, there are fans or not, and I don't think in the foreseeable future there will be, that they prioritize the scheduling of the women's game and not leave that, and kick that down the line 6 months, 7 months, and make sure that, they pressure men to go back and that those are the priorities. So that's what I would worry about.
Thank you. We'll come back to the scheduling shortly. So thank you for raising that now. Tatjana.
Yeah, for me, it's really the question on, why would you do something? Why would you continue to play? If there's an argument why you need to continue to play, you should do everything possible if you can. For me right now, I don't see it in the women's game. We have a lockdown of the country still, partly at least. Kids, men, women are not allowed to play football in their grassroots leagues and clubs. There are no training sessions for people in Switzerland to play football. So if we allow the women's elite to play, I would really need to know why and why would we do that? And again, as I said before, we don't have contractual obligations, so I just don't think it's needed. And if I look at the short-term, mid-term calendar, and Switzerland is not yet one of the top countries, but if I look at England, Germany, USA, you play the Olympics next year, and then you play the Euros, and then you play the World Cup, and and then you have a Champions League with more matches, and we have at the right time, right now, an overviews of players and injuries in women's football. And I just don't think it's so easy. We want equality, and we want not to be discriminated. And if the men play, we should look at the women's league, and if it makes sense, it should also play. But they should not play just because the men play. To me, that just doesn't make any sense. And in this respect, I think it's every country's decision, but you need to think about positioning the women's game, which is also seen as down to earth, more approachable, fair players, a family environment, role models for girls and boys. And, you have to ask yourself, if you keep that image, if you just play for the sake of the guys are playing, we play as well. I think you would need to be a bit more specific about that. And the closed doors matches will most likely and unfortunately become a reality for us in the next month, I assume. And as Annie said, the women have a bit more, are used to that, to playing less spectators. So I don't think that will be any problem. And even us as a fans of watching Premier League or Bundesliga men, we will get used to it.
Thank you. So Brenda and Tatjana both touched on scheduling in terms of kind of the packed football calendar that women's football is now going to face over the next 2 years with everything being pushed back. One of the questions that's been raised to me is this pandemic kind of interrupting the massive growth of women's football that we talked about at the start? The number of fans who've been going to matches, certainly across England in the WSL, the attendance is increasing. The Premier League for the men have talked about having every single match being available live to stream, but Brenda and Tatjana have both kind of raised the issue that perhaps women's football should be the priority here. Should it be women's football taking the priority and being available to stream without geo-blocking, let's say live worldwide, to make sure that the product is still getting to the fans? Amanda, what do you think to that?
Listen, as I said about health and security being a priority, I mean, I wouldn't go against that with this answer then, right? So, but I do think that if the opportunity exists, like, what a cool moment to think differently about how the game is seen. I mean, I said at the beginning that access is one of the key things that we need to build the game, grow the game, develop the game. And the television or digital media are key points of access, not only for aspiring footballers around the world, but for fans too. So, you know, before I came to FIFPro, I worked in fan engagement for 9 years in men's professional football in the United States. And it was moments of challenge, moments where we weren't quite sure, like when the hurricane hit in New York. When was that? That would have been back in, do you guys remember that big hurricane that came through and flooded all of New York City, and it was completely blacked out? And it was in that moment where, like, we just thought, okay, what is it that we can do in this really weird environment where we have no power and we can't get to the office and there's no soccer being played? Like, how can we innovate and do things differently? And from that, we had podcasts born, and we had new media franchises born, and really developed an entire MLS digital ecosystem that looked like nothing we had ever had before. And I think this could present kind of a similar, I don't know, maybe that's an analogy for where we are today, right? To take a step back and say, right, not where do we want to be 6 months from now, but what do we want women's football to look like 6 years from now? And how can we build whether it's a technology infrastructure in our stadiums to make sure that we have all the camera angles that we might need for men's and women's football as it evolves, to innovations in wearable tech or biotechnology and all of these things that can really make the game that much more compelling and consumable in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. Brenda, how do you feel about possibility of live streaming all over the place?
Well, that would be new for Latin American women's football. That would be brand spanking new. It is very, very difficult to get access. And one thing that's particular about South America is that because of CONMEBOL regulations with the club championship, the Libertadores, all the men's teams that compete in Libertadores have to technically have a women's team. Of course, we're kind of afraid of what's going to happen with that regulation moving forward. And a lot of people have mixed feelings, but for clubs to stream those, or for CONMEBOL, sometimes it's only CONMEBOL's live stream on Facebook that you can get it on. There's no consistent place where you can find it. There never has been. And it would be wonderful and really exciting if, again, with all the caveats about the health and safety of a workplace that all footballers deserve, it would be revolutionary for Latin American women's football to have any regular access. And I think people would be absolutely thrilled. When you go on the Facebook live streaming, you know, it's usually because 20 people, you know, tagged me on Twitter saying, where can I watch it? And, you know, we're all sort of frantically still looking, is this a CONMEBOL stream? Is this, maybe FIFA will stream some, maybe the league will. So that would be a really exciting digital ecosystem would be a fantastic thing to build in Latin American women's football.
Wonderful, thank you. Tatjana?
Yeah, I agree, actually. It's really hard to follow women's football worldwide, globally, and it's an opportunity. I really think this crisis is a chance for all of us. I hope the decision makers in all these clubs see it like this as well. I know that's a risk and it's maybe wishful thinking, but I do dream, and I think there's so many nice things you could do in the future because you come out of this crisis. You could have double matches. You can, make one venue and play the men and the women together before or after one or the other team. You could stream that through your channels, the club channels, to their fans. I know the ones who have media rights contracts, they will be in a position to give back something to the media rights companies because they can't or couldn't deliver all the matches which were in a contract. So you can package your matches and your football activities and do something new. You haven't done it before, and I think that's the best moment to do now, because we're in a crisis. People miss football. People love to watch football. The figures in Germany last weekend were exceptional. So everybody was watching the men's Bundesliga. And I think now if the women start as well in Germany, they could do some sort of, combinations and maybe worldwide. And I think that's what we need to ask for out of women's football from our clubs and players and officials, that we try to get in this whole men's pro ecosystem and be together with them and make something together. So I think there might be opportunities to come up with creative ideas we haven't thought about. It's the best time to do it now.
Thank you. And Neat, obviously the FA introduced the FA Player, this digital ecosystem, this season, so that all the WSL matches are available to watch via streaming, apart from the ones that are already on television. So, I mean, how would you feel about kind of everything being available to stream kind of all the time, even the ones on television, even your cup games?
Yeah, I think it'd be amazing. Obviously, like everyone said, it'd be revolutionary because, you're predisposing lots of people to new access to global women's football and understanding, the different elements of the game that exist culturally for women in football as well. And in terms of innovation, like you're saying, FA Player is a great resource, but the point is just having opportunity to begin with in the mainstream media, which we've lacked. It's just getting us that opportunity. And now is a greater time than any, as you say, to give women that increased visibility, prioritize our scheduling and our games. And, a lot of clubs now, especially in the UK, we're affiliated to big men's clubs. It's about big men's clubs also encompassing us within that package and saying when they talk to their stakeholders, the media, the commercial partners, that listen, the women's brand is part of our whole brand, and this is also how we want to push it. And it's also a big part of our community and our culture. And it gets them to also sort of co-sign on this new progression for the sport as a whole. How do we move out this pandemic into a new era for the game collectively, I think, ultimately.
Wonderful, thank you. And yes, you mentioned about men's teams and women's teams affiliating to them. I'm going to throw this one to Brenda first because she also touched on it. How do you think football can strike a balance, I guess, between providing women with the necessary financial backing and security coming from men's clubs, but also maintaining the individual identity and protecting the future of women's clubs? I mean, can that balance be struck, do you think?
Well, it's really difficult. I mean, one of the sort of buoys for women's football in Latin America over the last 5 years has been the emergence of the Ni Una Menos movement, which is a very heterogeneous feminist movement. And it really sort of embraced women's football for the first time, mainstream feminism as an issue, that this was really important: stadium safety, respect for women as fans and players as laborers. And that's like the first time in 120-year history that we've really seen feminism sort of place football on an agenda and say, this represents the nation, then we have a stake in this, and this isn't fair. And a lot of athletes that may not even identify with that particular movement have seen it as a big boon. And it's done a lot for grassroots women's football and girls and youth development. So, in terms of a tradition of like an identity that a club has, like maybe like a Wolfsburg or something like that, there hasn't been that kind of stability in Latin American women's football. But what a lot of women are questioning or hesitant about is just what kind of football do you want? And the phrase in Spanish is either you want football feminista, feminist football, or you want football femenino, women's football, and that those aren't always the same thing. So what does it mean then to go forward with men's clubs, especially because there's trans clubs, there's LGBT clubs and leagues that have affiliated with and been big fans of the women's game. So now what does it mean to incorporate into these clubs? So it's a tension, but I think it's a productive conversation. And I think that having those groups really involved, those grassroots, sort of clubs involved, makes a huge difference. Also, they're not privately owned clubs. So even these big professional clubs like Flamengo, right? These are mutually owned. The directors are voted on. It's a very different structure. And a lot of people feel like that's going to perhaps give them an in to sort of get a bigger voice than it would if it was owned by one particular person or investor or something like that. But we'll see.
Neat, you just mentioned about the way that your club worked with the men's equivalent. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship and how that works?
Well, I think just having access to the training ground and being able to use the facility every day and having full-time technical staff, medical staff, pool access to the pool, all those things. Of course, there are lots of elements that we're still trying to develop and push in terms of a more synergized feeling within the club as a whole. But I think from that aspect, it's already a step in the right direction. And if those, clubs like Chelsea can get other clubs in the men's game as well to follow suit and commit to the women's clubs by giving them better access and opportunity, as Brenda mentioned, from grassroots all the way up, then I think they'll be better for it, because like you say, they're beacons of their communities as well. And the fans and people that paid for tickets to come there are part of that. And that will include their daughters, their grandmothers, their grandfathers, and everyone alike. So it's about bringing everybody in from whatever domain or perspective. And it's not necessarily about having a separation, but trying to push this discussion forward and also challenge the culture that exists within football as a whole and men's football, and say, is it always right? Is it always okay to have that kind of machisto, whatever, behavior as well, and try to sort of learn some of the good elements of the women's game and how our fans engage with us as well.
Thank you. Tatjana, how do you feel about the affiliation of women's teams to men's clubs?
Yeah, I think we have seen clearly a trend in that direction, and it's paid off. England is a great case example where you can see that this makes sense, and we heard all the benefits and the positive advancements. It has a price, of course. I think right now, if you look at the situation, it looks like it's the best way forward for the pro and elite level, just because the men's pro clubs are so developed, so big, and so many opportunities that the women can only take advantage if they're part of it. So I think if you talk about the elite level, probably it does make sense for the moment. For a women's only club, it seems to be really difficult to to offer the same infrastructure and conditions to female players, just because the lack of money they have. But I think in this respect, we need to, I would love to see a more differentiated approach. If you talk about the elite level, then you talk about maybe men's pro clubs who have women's and men's teams, just because it makes sense, and they should, because they're a club. If you talk about more grassroots level, then it's just a football club, and they should have women and men anyway, and kids and boys and girls. And so it really comes down a little bit to what are you actually talking about. There might be women's only clubs on a grassroots and amateur level, just to increase girls and have a huge girls and women squad and basis, whereas in a mixed club there are less girls. So I think we can keep that open, but on the elite level it does make sense to work together with a men's elite club. But I would also say, as I've always said, it all comes down to structure and decision-making power. Otherwise you take a risk of being decided over your heads. Maybe not in England, because it has so established and it's professionalized, and the FA is having all these concepts. But in other countries like Latin America, we heard, it can't be just a a joy for the guys to say, well, let's have a women's team, and a year later they close it, and a year later they open it. It has to be serious, and that's, you know, you need to be really involved in the club structure.
Mm. And I guess we're coming back to that issue of precarity again that we've already touched on. Amanda, how would you feel about this?
Well, I think there's a conversation to be had around value of women and value of women's football. And, you know, Brenda started off talking about the precarity of women in society in South America. And it took me back to the first time I was introduced to Australia's equal pay deal that they arrived at with their players, the professional players in Australia, the national team and the federation agreed to equal pay between the men and the women, and conditions as well. So I remember the presentation that they shared, though. The first slide of it was actually about gender equality in Australia. So it wasn't about fighting for gender equality through football. It was actually the society itself recognizes that women are equal, and the value of that then transcends sport. Now, I think there's also a case to be made the opposite way, right? Where actually we can use football as this powerful tool to demonstrate the value that women bring to society at large. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic to focus on, not just in relation to the game itself, but when we start to look at the value of women as part of a larger club, women's football as part of a larger club. I think there's opportunity that so often we confine it as economic value, but actually the value that a women's football team or program brings to your club can be so much more. It can enhance sponsorship. So there are definitely whether it's Coca-Cola to Adidas to Nike. I mean, these organizations are looking for institutions that value gender equality and as a core component of who they are and who they represent. And so I think the opportunity to attract actually more money as a result of having a women's program is something that we need to really think about in our policies and our processes and our structures. So for me, the conversation isn't about the strain that a women's football program would have on a men's team by any stretch. Actually, it's what's the value that you're bringing at a relatively low cost opportunity, and then within that, we can learn from the men's program about how to accelerate the women's game and how to accelerate the opportunity for players to be the very best that they can be. Because we've seen that in the men's game, right? We've seen men's football create these optimal environments. I mean, Neitz has talked about the training environment that they have at Chelsea, or the conditions that the players are able to, the staff. I mean, they have a incredible staff that learns from across their institution, right? And so what are the things that we can then learn from and take and incorporate in a gender specific way, to Tatjana's point?
Wonderful, thank you. Just jump back a little bit now with this piece of breaking news about 6 male players at English Premier League clubs have tested positive in their first tests for coronavirus, which were conducted yesterday with a view to going back to small group training at training grounds possibly tomorrow or later in the week. So it starts to obviously raise the questions of health and safety that we touched on at the start of this discussion. And it starts to make me wonder, I mean, we're not going to go back to the normal that we had before, are we, at all? Football, as we know it, is not going to resume in that form, I don't think, anytime soon. If players are going to have to be tested every other day, if players are going to have to be quarantined or put into isolation if they do test positive, the people who work at grounds are going to be coming into contact, all this social contact that you're having. You can't be having 10,000 people in a stadium. I mean, this is going to be a huge challenge for football in general, but women's football particularly at this time of potential massive growth. We're now at this kind of, I feel like we're at a point of a precipice, almost at the top of a roller coaster. Where are we going to go next? I mean, what do you think women's football's biggest challenge is going to be when football resumes, is it going to be, you know, convincing people to actually go to the ground? Is it going to be kind of fighting for a fighting for a piece of the media landscape, you know, with other leagues all going on and the possibility of streaming everywhere we've already discussed? I don't know. What do we think? Brenda, what do you think the biggest challenge is going to be when football resumes for women's football?
I think that sexism is the biggest challenge that women's football will face before, during, and after the coronavirus. I mean, just patent sexism, lack of transparency, neglect. I think, though, to not be doomy and gloomy too much, hopefully we're looking at what we've talked about as a wonderful opportunity to really press forward and to really put a lot of energy towards rethinking, reconsidering, prioritizing. When Amanda's talking about the value of women, the value of gender equality in a particular place, you know, it just makes me feel like it's wonderful to attract sponsorship, and I know that's so important, but we also, I think, need to press forward and challenge the narrative that it's all about marketing, because honestly, there's no other industry that's probably been bailed out more by the government, that has more government investment than men's football. The 2014 World Cup, untold billions of dollars. And so I think it's important to go back to what Amanda said about the value, that there's something more than just saying, well, you need X market. That's it. You know, sustainability is all based upon its market value, and that we need to kind of rethink from an innovative, creative, humanity-focused narrative what women's football can both like change about those national identities and change about social good in football.
Yeah, when you say about sexism is the biggest problem it has faced, does face, will always face, that's kind of the case in all of society, though. It's not just women's football. This is a societal problem that women deal with. It's not just about football.
And of course, intersectional, right? It's not, it's also, you know, it's something that white women experience very differently than women of color, that straight women experience very differently. So it's not just to sort of say, well, it's only sexism. Of course, women of color, when we're talking about precarity in places like Brazil and places like Peru, have particular challenges that are even more difficult. And when, you know, the media focus is not on the performance, it's even easier to sort of cut women players right and left, that if you have a sponsorship focus that you don't think are going to sell in a particular way that society says. So all of these challenges will remain going forward. So I just want to clarify that one. I mean, sexism is its biggest challenge. I know that women don't experience sexism all in the exact same way too.
Of course, but I think you're also saying that sexism is kind of structural, isn't it? I mean, would you say that sexism is still built into the structures of football? We've seen, you know, horrendous stories come out in the past few years about the way that women have been treated within different football authorities across the world, but also kind of in the more kind of microaggressions and the everyday kind of thing, just the snide little bits of sexism that you see, you know, the odd tweets that you still get, those kind of things.
Well, it's pretty blatant in Latin America. I mean, the women's national coach was found to be guilty of sexual harassment this year, and also abuse of minors for the youth women's national team. So these are not small microaggression incidents, though the small microaggressions obviously happen on a daily basis. But that's one of the things that, you know, the report that we did at FAIR, we also tried to put on the table really clearly, is that any cuts or any austerity or any consideration also must take into account the things that women as workers on the pitch face in a very different way when they leave. And I can just tell you, I mean, there's not a quota system in CONMEBOL. There has never been a real permanent woman representative in that governing body. So sexism structural is par excellence. It's absolutely structural. And when there are clubs that, for example, Tolima in Colombia, a top tier club, the owner of the club, or president of the club, I'm sorry, said, you know, women's football is just a petri dish for lesbianism. That was last year. So these are not, you know, these are not small things. And so I think that it just tells you, I know that there's lots of people involved in women's football that are not sexist, a lot of men that are not sexist and allies within that structure, but you can see what the women are facing.
Absolutely. Tatjana, what do you think women's football's biggest challenge will be when football can finally resume again?
If nothing changes, then we haven't used the opportunity. I hope we can use it. This is, to me, as I said, a crisis, and it's a chance. So everybody talks now about, health and safety first. Everybody talks about, we have to help each other, support each other, respect each other, do fundraising, and this is just, I think, the momentum to say, let's put football equally on the map. And all these things Brenda said, it's not new, it's known, and it's not only in Latin America, it's in Africa, it's in Asia, it's in parts of Europe. And I think we're all really tired of it, especially if you're in this game for a bit longer, and it just doesn't stop. In this respect, I would really say it's time to do a top-down approach from FIFA to the confederations, to the clubs, to the elite leagues, to ECA and all these decision makers in the elite game, to come up with clear procedures and requirements on how women's football has to be involved. If not now, of course we can wait another 20 years, but there's a risk that it goes down. There's a risk that we have a lack of media attention maybe. We don't know what the decision makers do in the near future, if they stream women's football or not, if the TV rights of the Women's World Cup will go to these countries. We don't know. It's such a unique moment. I'm not critical. Well, I don't fear a negative impact. I really hope, and I'm actually quite sure it can't. Women's football has such momentum and has proven so much its value and it's right for existence basically, and its fan base and its people watching it. And the Women's World Cup last year was such a huge success. We can't go back, and we will not go back, and the public and the society will not accept to go back. But the decision makers haven't really found out how to use this, not yet, there's still time, but how to use this momentum now that we're in a critical moment, to link the money they give to associations to clearer criteria, to ask for rules, to ask for women to be involved, to ask for structure. It's now. So I hope we can actually get something positive out of this, because to make it clearer and to make more rules around it, so it doesn't fear any laid back actions.
Wonderful, thank you. Anita, biggest challenge do you think women's football will face once we get back to playing again?
I think, as we're seeing, the challenge is faced within all of football, and we're just a part of that process. And ultimately, I just think the women's game isn't there to be just replicating the men's game either. We are a unique entity within ourselves. So, like you say, now's a chance for us actually to stop and be introspective and look about how we can progress out of this pandemic. And one of those things is, even if we don't resume playing and the men do, it's still about how can we be treated equally moving forward. What are they going to put in place in terms of the processes, the policies and structure to make sure that we can still build on the momentum we've created. I think it's a lot harder position for clubs, especially in the UK, but I'm sure in many countries as well, to sort of put us to the side, because the women's game has become more visible. There's a lot more, vocal activism as well among athletes as well as clubs, etc. So we position ourselves in a place where I think it will be challenging for them to not place us into their considerations moving forward, because it's not just a question of women's football, it's a question of football's place in society within this pandemic now as well. And so they also have a sort of, in my opinion, a moral obligation to make sure that they are trying to represent the values of our society as a whole and how we want to move forward. And that includes where we place women within that moving forward.
Thank you. And Amanda?
Neat. It's such a joy to hear you talk about your perspective on the game. For those of you who don't know, Anita is part of our Global Player Council at FIFPro, and we've organized this group so that we hear directly from the players, and they can give us their opinion, their perspective, their understanding of where the game is. and what their experiences of it, and importantly, what their opinions are about what the future of it should look like. And I think that we need more involvement across the board of key stakeholders, including players, in what the future of women's football looks like. Because as you can see, they have thoughts, and they have experiences, and they have amazing recommendations that we can all learn from. For me, there's three things related to that. One is in terms of concerns, but also opportunities. One is the professionalism of the game and the resources allocated to it. So we launched the Raising Our Game report on the 30th of April at FIFPro, which you can get on FIFPro.org. And one of the key recommendations that we made after listening to players and doing research and studies and surveys, along with our research partner KPMG, was that we need to put in place global labor standards, so that women there is a structure and there is an expectation for what their playing environment must look like. And ultimately, if we can achieve these standards, it will create a much better environment for our players to achieve it at their highest levels, right? Two, within that, one of the biggest challenges we had in compiling this report was a lack of data, a lack of information. And just we've already referenced data that's come out from the men's game in their COVID-19 report, which is great, or their COVID-19 testing, but also we need to be testing and tracking women. And until we track the data and insights related to women's football, how do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been? And I think that's one of the great challenges for us, is tracking this global epidemic and the impacts that it's having around the world, whether you're in Asia, Africa, the United States, Latin America, South America. It's really hard to get a handle on where was it professional, where have we now lost leagues, where are players losing contracts and opportunities. And I think as we return to play, it's going to be really, really assessing that landscape and making sure that we understand what the implications of COVID-19 were, because we're still in the middle of it, right? So I think that's going to be one of our challenges. We do have, with our report, we do have where it was up until coronavirus. We have the data up until that moment. And so I hope we can use this as the launching pad for where it can go. And the last thing is related to what Tatjana said, this top-down institutional approach to change. But I think the challenge inherent in that is that every country is dealing with local government rules and institutionalized processes. But we're a global ecosystem of football. So how do you rectify that kind of top-down approach with a really localized tactical makeup? And for me, it comes down to what we said in the COVID-19 implications for women's professional football report that we published on April 16th, which was that all of the stakeholders need to come together in this conversation, which brings me right back to where I started with NEETs and with players. But ultimately, it is going to take a global effort. And a visionary one. I think for all of us to get in a room and have this conversation is incredibly compelling, and we need all the voices to make sure that women's football not only survives, which to Tatjana's point, women's football certainly will, but thrives. And in countries, like Brenda's talking about in South America, we really need to put a lens in these areas and really understand what's happening, track it, research it, talk about it. So, do I think the future is bright for women's football? Absolutely. But I don't think it's a given. I think it's going to take us rolling up our sleeves as an international, global community, both men's and women's football, and make sure that we're putting our time, energies, resources, passions, ambitions, all towards its success.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I couldn't have summed it up any better myself with my script, so I'm just going to ignore that bit now. Over the past hour and a bit, we have gone through a lot of questions, a lot of stuff, going from the coronavirus pandemic to the current state of women's football globally, identified some challenges, put forward some potential solutions and what we'd like to see happen in the near and long-term future. So I would like to thank our panelists today, Brenda, Amanda, Tatjana and Anita. Thank you very, very much for your time, and thank you to FAIR for having us. I'm Carrie Dunn, and thank you for joining us today.